The road didn't vanish. The world looked away. At first, no one noticed when the road began to disappear. It was still there on the map, still marked with a thin gray line connecting towns that no longer spoke to each other. Cars still passed sometimes, rarely, as if out of habit rather than need, and people assumed roads, like promises, were permanent. They were wrong. The road did not collapse or crack dramatically. It simply lost attention. Maintenance crews stopped coming, signs faded, reflectors fell one by one. And when accidents happened, response times grew longer, not because help was far, but because the road was no longer important enough to hurry for. Families lived along it once. Small houses, gas stations, diners, places that depended on passing strangers. Children learned to recognize cars by sound. Nights were filled with headlights cutting through darkness. The road was a lifeline, noisy, imperfect, alive. Then routes changed. Highways were built elsewhere. Efficiency improved. Traffic was redirected. The road remained, but relevance did not. Businesses closed quietly. Owners left notes on doors that no one read. Some stayed, believing abandonment was temporary, believing attention would return. It never did. People aged faster on forgotten roads, without visitors, without investment. Time pressed harder. Medical emergencies became fatal more often. Supplies arrived late or not at all, and deaths were recorded as individual misfortunes, never as patterns. Children grew up knowing their address embarrassed adults. Teachers hesitated when saying the road's name. Mail arrived inconsistently. Records began listing residents as remote. Remote is how disappearance begins. One winter, a crash happened. A car slid off the road. No witnesses, no immediate report. The wreck was found days later, frozen. The incident closed quickly. No investigation into why the road had no barriers. No lighting, no maintenance. The file stated driver error. Files prefer blame over responsibility. After that, people stopped traveling at night. Then they stopped traveling at all. The road grew quieter. Not empty, but uncertain. The kind of quiet that makes sound feel dangerous. Houses stood with lights on and no visitors. Radios filled the absence, and people learned to live smaller lives. Above, planners updated maps. The road was marked low priority. That phrase ended more lives than any accident. Because once a place is low priority, everything that happens there becomes acceptable loss. Ambulances avoided it. Repairs were delayed indefinitely. Budgets moved on. People still lived there, but officially the road was already gone. And when people disappear after that, no one asks why. The road understood before the people did. It understood that survival now depended on memory, and memory was already leaving. The first families did not leave together. They left unevenly, one house at a time, one excuse at a time, a medical emergency that never recovered, a job offer that could not be refused, a child sent away temporarily and never brought back. Departure became survival disguised as choice. Those who stayed learned quickly what the road no longer provided. Mail arrived late, sometimes opened, sometimes not at all. Emergency numbers rang longer before anyone answered. Power outages lasted days, not hours. When the elderly died, it was quiet. No sirens, no urgency, just paperwork completed later. Deaths were categorized individually. Heart failure, exposure, accident. Never neglect, never isolation, never abandonment. The system requires causes that do not point outward. Children noticed patterns before adults admitted them. They counted how many houses went dark. They memorized which doors never opened again. They learned which names not to ask about. School buses stopped turning onto the road. The official explanation was efficiency. Fewer children, longer routes, but the effect was simple. Children became invisible. Attendance dropped, records adjusted, Absences justified until they became permanent. One family tried to complain. Letters were sent. Calls were made. Meetings were promised. Nothing followed. Complaints lose power when they come from places already marked as low priority. Frustration aged people faster than time ever could. Resignation replaced anger. Silence replaced demands. Then the relocations began. Not organized, not announced. People were advised to move for their own safety. Housing assistance mentioned, but never completed. Addresses changed in documents long before bodies moved in reality. And when families disappeared, it was assumed they had left willingly. No follow-up required. Empty houses attract attention. Strangers arrived, not to help, but to strip what remained. Copper wires vanished, windows broke. Fires started accidentally and burned without response. The road became known locally for being dangerous, not because of crime, but because of neglect. Fear finished what policy started. Parents stopped letting children walk outside. Neighbors stopped trusting neighbors. Lights turned off earlier each night. The road grew darker. One by one, people learned the truth without ever saying it aloud. No one was coming back for them. The road had been given up on, and anything that happened next would be filed, not fixed. Above, maps were updated again. Some houses disappeared from property databases. Service zones were redrawn. The road's name shortened, then abbreviated. Erasure prefers efficiency. By the end of the year, only a few families remained. They did not stay because they believed in the road. They stayed because leaving required resources they no longer had. And so the road continued. Still visible, still paved, still technically existing, while the people along it slowly stopped being counted. Children learned early that the road had rules adults never explained. They learned which stretches to avoid after dark, where the pavement dipped sharply without warning, which houses were empty enough to echo when you passed them, and which ones were empty in a way that felt watched. School became optional by distance, not by choice. Those still enrolled traveled farther each year, some waking before sunrise, some sleeping in borrowed homes during the week. Attendance records showed decline without explanation. Administrators marked it as relocation, not disappearance. Records prefer certainty. One boy stopped coming in winter. His absence was noted once, then justified, then ignored. His desk reassigned, his name removed from lists to avoid confusion. No inquiry followed because his address was already flagged as unstable. Unstable is how concern is avoided. Parents along the road stopped reporting things. When pets went missing, when fences were broken, when lights flickered strangely at night. Reporting required follow-up, and follow-up never arrived. So silence became habit. A fire burned one abandoned house completely, the flames visible from miles away. No trucks came until morning by then. Nothing remained worth saving. The report listed it as property loss, not risk, not warning. Children watched from windows. They learned how quickly places could be erased without consequence. One evening, 2 siblings failed to return home. They had walked the road before, hundreds of times, knew every crack, every bend. Their absence was noticed quickly, but response was slow. Searches began hours later, poorly coordinated. Volunteers walked sections already unsafe. Official involvement remained minimal. By morning, there was no sign, no witnesses, no evidence, no urgency. The case was labeled unresolved, then inactive, then archived. Their family moved shortly after. Their departure was documented as relocation. Missing children become easier to accept when the adults connected to them leave too. The road absorbed the fear. Parents restricted movement further. Windows were boarded, curtains drawn even during the day. Children stopped playing outside. Laughter disappeared. not suddenly but by agreement, the kind made without words. Above, demographic data adjusted. Youth populations declined. Service needs reduced. Funding reallocated. The system interpreted this as success. No protests, no appeals, no resistance, only quiet compliance. The road no longer felt like a place to grow up. It felt temporary, and when places feel temporary, people stop planning futures there. They stop asking what comes next. They only ask how long they can last. By the time the authorities noticed the pattern, it had already been renamed. They did not call it disappearance. They called it decline. Decline sounds natural, inevitable, something that happens without cause, without responsibility. And once a word like that enters a report, solutions quietly leave the room. Case files were reviewed in bulk. Missing persons reclassified. Unresolved incidents merged. Timelines shortened to reduce complexity. Complexity delays closure. Closure keeps systems moving. Investigators who asked too many questions were reassigned, not as punishment but as efficiency. The road was not considered high impact enough to justify prolonged attention. High impact places have audiences. The road had none. Families who remained were contacted through standardized letters, advising relocation for safety reasons. Assistance mentioned vaguely, never clearly enough to demand. People signed forms they barely understood because refusing felt pointless. Signatures replaced consent. Once forms were filed, responsibility ended. Cases were closed with language that sounded final without being accurate. Phrases like no further leads and voluntary departure appeared frequently, even when neither was true. Paper has the power to decide reality. The road's reputation changed beyond its borders. It was now spoken of carefully, as somewhere unfortunate, unsafe, best avoided. Taxi drivers refused fares. Delivery services declined routes. Isolation became reinforced by fear rather than policy. Fear is cheaper than enforcement. A woman stayed when everyone else left. She lived alone near the sharpest bend in the road. Her husband had died years earlier, her children long gone. She refused relocation, not out of defiance, but because leaving meant abandoning the only place that remembered her life correctly. One winter night, her power went out. No one noticed. Her death was discovered weeks later by chance. The report listed natural causes, age-related, no mention of delayed response, no mention of infrastructure failure. Her house was cleared, her land reassigned, her existence compressed into a paragraph. The road did not record her passing. It recorded efficiency. Above, databases updated again. Population, negligible. Risk, contained. Status under observation. Observation replaced action. With each update, the road became less real, less urgent, easier to ignore. Forgetting was no longer accidental, it was procedural. And when forgetting becomes routine, it stops feeling like loss. It starts feeling like progress. Relocation was never announced as removal. It was framed as protection. Families were told the road was no longer safe, that staying carried risks no one could justify. Options were presented as assistance. Temporary housing, support elsewhere, but timelines were vague, destinations uncertain. And once people left, follow-up ended. Protection only lasts until compliance is achieved. Trucks arrived without ceremony. Not moving vans, just utility vehicles, collecting what was left behind, boarding up structures, removing signage, stripping the road of anything that suggested permanence. The work was fast, efficient, impersonal. Efficiency leaves no room for memory. People who resisted were documented as uncooperative. Files were updated accordingly. Resistance once recorded justifies abandonment. Some families left in the night. They packed what they could carry, leaving behind furniture, photographs, graves they could not move. They believed leaving quietly might preserve dignity. But silence does not preserve anything. It accelerates forgetting. Children were registered in new districts under simplified histories, previous addresses omitted to avoid complications. Teachers never asked where they came from, and the children learned not to explain. Explaining requires listeners. Adults found work elsewhere, but never enough stability to return. The road became a reference they avoided, something that complicated conversations, something better left unmentioned. Back on the road, emptiness solidified. Windows shattered under weather alone. Roofs collapsed without witnesses. Vegetation reclaimed edges deliberately. Nature was blamed for decay, as if neglect had not prepared the ground. One last service station stayed open longer than expected. Its owner refused relocation forms, continued selling fuel to almost no one. He believed presence itself was resistance. One night, the station burned, officially ruled accidental. No investigation reopened, no motive considered. After that, the road lost its final function. It no longer connected places. It no longer supported life. It existed only as infrastructure without purpose. Above, the final classification was made. The road was downgraded from residential access to secondary passage. Maintenance suspended indefinitely. Emergency response rerouted. The decision written as optimization. Optimization never asks who is left behind. Maps were updated. The road's name was shortened again, then removed from most navigation systems entirely. It remained physically present but digitally absent, and absence in data carries authority. If something is not searchable, it is effectively gone. People still passed nearby without realizing. They felt the quiet but never questioned it. The road had reached the point of no return. Not because it collapsed, but because no one was officially meant to remember it anymore. The final disappearances did not happen suddenly. They happened after documentation. Once a place is recorded as empty, anything that remains becomes an error, and errors are corrected, not investigated. A survey team passed through the road one morning. They took photographs from a distance, noted structural decay, logged coordinates, and confirmed what the databases already claimed. No residents, no activity, no services required. They did not knock on doors. They were not instructed to. Instructions matter more than reality. One man was still there. He lived near the far end of the road, in a house half hidden by trees. He had stopped receiving mail years earlier, stopped expecting power to stay on, stopped believing his existence required acknowledgement. He survived by routine, by repetition, by pretending the road still mattered. When he died, there was no report. No one filed one. His body was discovered months later during a drainage inspection. The case closed immediately, unidentified, unclaimed. The record listed the location as uninhabited zone. Zones do not require names. Data systems adjusted smoothly. A final cleanup entry was made. Remaining structures categorized as unsafe. Access restricted. Historical relevance marked as none. Nothing illegal occurred. That was the most disturbing part. Children who had once lived there grew older elsewhere, carrying memories no one wanted to hear. When they spoke of the road, listeners smiled politely, assuming exaggeration, assuming nostalgia, assuming trauma had distorted facts. Trauma is easier to dismiss than responsibility. Photographs from the road survived online briefly, then disappeared under algorithmic decay. Posts without engagement fade, and fading is indistinguishable from deletion. Search results thinned, then vanished. The road still existed physically, but without representation, it had lost legitimacy. People trust screens more than soil. If a place cannot be found digitally, it is treated as rumor. Authorities closed the last administrative loop. The road was officially absorbed into surrounding land management zones. No longer a separate entity, no longer accountable, no longer referenced by name. It became background, and background is where things go to die quietly. The land adapted faster than memory. Grass grew over cracks. Animals crossed freely. Weather erased markings. Soon, it became difficult to prove anyone had ever lived there at all, except for the feeling. Those who passed nearby felt it, an unease without source, a heaviness without explanation. But unease does not trigger investigations. It only triggers avoidance. The road had not been destroyed. It had been corrected. Silence did not arrive all at once. It settled gradually after the last record was closed, after the final designation was approved, after the road stopped being referenced in meetings, budgets, or warnings. Silence arrives when no one expects an answer anymore. The barriers went up quietly, not to protect people, but to discourage curiosity. Signs were placed far enough away to feel official, close enough to feel unnecessary. Restricted access, unsafe terrain, words chosen to stop movement without inviting questions. No one challenged them. Curiosity rarely survives inconvenience. The road faded from memory faster than it faded from sight. Drivers adjusted routes. Hikers avoided the area. Local stories shortened until they lost meaning. Children grew up nearby without learning the road's name. Unnamed places are easier to forget. At night, the road still existed. Moonlight traced its curves. Wind moved debris across cracked asphalt. Rain followed grooves worn by decades of travel. But no one listened. Silence became structural. Animals nested freely. Trees leaned into the pavement. The line between road and land blurred. Nature was credited for reclaiming it, as if nature had made the decision, as if abandonment had not opened the door. Above, surveillance systems continued their rotations. From satellites, the road appeared intact enough. No traffic meant no issue. No heat signatures meant success. Absence confirmed policy. Silence validated everything. Somewhere far away, former residents tried to explain. They spoke of delays, of unanswered calls, of how life narrowed before it vanished. But their words sounded scattered, emotional, inconsistent. Without records, testimony weakens. Without acknowledgement, truth feels optional. Their stories were filed under personal accounts. Personal accounts do not alter systems. The road now existed only as a sensation, a feeling people could not name, a heaviness without context, a discomfort that encouraged distance. That was enough. The silence held. Nothing interrupted it. No return, no discovery, no correction. The road had reached permanence, not as infrastructure, but as absence. And absence, once normalized, becomes invisible. Once the silence proved stable, it was repackaged. Stability invites opportunity. A proposal circulated quietly, suggesting the area be reclassified as preserved land. Untouched, quiet, ideal for controlled access. The language avoided history entirely, focusing instead on atmosphere. Atmosphere sells better than truth. New markers appeared along nearby highways. Scenic route, nature corridor, quiet escape. The road itself was not mentioned, but it did not need to be. Erasure works best when it feels intentional rather than corrective. Visitors arrived with cameras and expectations. They parked at designated points, walked marked trails that curved away from the pavement, admired the quiet, called it peaceful. They felt refreshed by a silence they did not understand. They took photos of cracked asphalt framed by trees and labeled them beautiful. Beauty is easier than accountability. Guides told simple stories. They spoke of outdated routes, of communities that had moved on long ago. They never mentioned timelines, never named families, never explained how quickly life had ended. Speed makes stories uncomfortable. A small viewing platform was built near the bend where accidents once happened. No plaque explained why the bend mattered. No acknowledgement softened the view. Tourists stood there, unaware they were standing where help had failed repeatedly. Souvenirs were sold, maps simplified. The road became an aesthetic. Former residents watched from a distance, sometimes returning quietly, walking the edges of places they were no longer allowed to enter. Their memories felt out of place among signage and curated paths. Security was polite but firm. Private land, protected zone, restricted access. Protection again, but this time from the people who remembered. Online, the road gained a reputation. A hidden gem, an eerie place, a perfect spot for solitude. The comments praised the emptiness. No one asked where it came from. Digital content replaced lived experience. Videos with slow music and wide shots erased human scale completely. The algorithm rewarded silence. Above, administrative satisfaction settled in. The area now generated value without requiring responsibility. Forgetting had become profitable. And once forgetting pays, remembering becomes inconvenient. The road had been transformed. Not destroyed, not erased, curated. The final disappearances did not happen suddenly. They happened after documentation. Once a place is recorded as empty, anything that remains becomes an error, and errors are corrected, not investigated. A survey team passed through the road one morning. They took photographs from a distance, noted structural decay, logged coordinates, and confirmed what the databases already claimed. No residents, no activity, no services required. They did not knock on doors. They were not instructed to. Instructions matter more than reality. One man was still there. He lived near the far end of the road, in a house half hidden by trees. He had stopped receiving mail years earlier, stopped expecting power to stay on, stopped believing his existence required acknowledgement. He survived by routine, by repetition, by pretending the road still mattered. When he died, there was no report. No one filed one. His body was discovered months later during a drainage inspection. The case closed immediately, unidentified, unclaimed. The record listed the location as uninhabited zone. Zones do not require names. Data systems adjusted smoothly. A final cleanup entry was made. Remaining structures categorized as unsafe. Access restricted. Historical relevance marked as none. Nothing illegal occurred. That was the most disturbing part. Children who had once lived there grew older elsewhere, carrying memories no one wanted to hear. When they spoke of the road, listeners smiled politely, assuming exaggeration, assuming nostalgia, assuming trauma had distorted facts. Trauma is easier to dismiss than responsibility. Photographs from the road survived online briefly, then disappeared under algorithmic decay. Posts without engagement fade, and fading is indistinguishable from deletion. Search results thinned, then vanished. The road still existed physically, but without representation, it had lost legitimacy. People trust screens more than soil. If a place cannot be found digitally, it is treated as rumor. Authorities closed the last administrative loop. The road was officially absorbed into surrounding land management zones. No longer a separate entity, no longer accountable, no longer referenced by name. It became background, and background is where things go to die quietly. The land adapted faster than memory. Grass grew over cracks. Animals crossed freely. Weather erased markings. Soon, it became difficult to prove anyone had ever lived there at all, except for the feeling. Those who passed nearby felt it, an unease without source, a heaviness without explanation. But unease does not trigger investigations. It only triggers avoidance. The road had not been destroyed. It had been corrected. By the time the road became famous, it was no longer recognized as a road. It was a concept, a location tagged for mood rather than meaning, visited for atmosphere rather than understanding. The cracks in the asphalt were framed as texture, the collapsed structures as mystery. Everything broken was renamed aesthetic. People came looking for ruins, not realizing ruins usually follow lives, not legends. Small groups wandered closer than permitted. They crossed faded barriers, stepped onto the old pavement, felt a strange pressure they could not explain. The silence here felt different, heavier, as if it resisted being observed. Some turned back quickly, others stayed longer, filming, narrating, inventing stories to fill the gap left by truth. Invented stories are easier to digest. Online theories spread, abandoned due to superstition, closed after accidents, victims of natural decline. Each theory removed responsibility from people and placed it elsewhere. Nature, fate, coincidence, anything but decisions. Fragments were taken, pieces of signage, chunks of asphalt, house numbers pulled from walls, proof of visitation, proof without context. These objects traveled far, sat on shelves, lost meaning. The road was being dismantled into souvenirs. Below the surface, a new assessment was completed. Resource surveys indicated potential value beneath the land. Extraction possibilities discussed cautiously. No immediate plans announced. But the designation changed again, from preserved to monitored. Monitoring is preparation. Once land becomes useful, memory becomes an obstacle. Former residents filed complaints. They cited ownership disputes, unmarked graves, missing records, but their claims lacked documentation. Files had been closed years earlier. Data could not be retrieved because it had been deemed unnecessary. Without proof, experience becomes anecdote. A hearing was scheduled, postponed, then canceled. Interest had shifted. Public attention now favored the road as an eerie destination, not as a failure. Challenging the narrative risked ruining something people enjoyed. Enjoyment often wins over truth. The final narrative settled quietly. The road had declined naturally. People had left voluntarily. Nothing improper had occurred. Once a narrative is repeated enough, it hardens. Correction becomes intrusion. The road was now protected from its own history. And as the last challenges faded, as memory lost its final legal footing, the place entered its final form. Complete forgetting, fully justified. Nothing was uncovered in the end. There was no final report exposing failure, no document leaked to force accountability, no moment where the world paused and admitted what it had done. Endings like that are rare. Most endings arrive as acceptance. The road remained physically intact enough to appear harmless, broken enough to justify neglect. It existed in a state that required no explanation, no attention, no care. That was its final purpose. Above, systems continued to function perfectly. Maps showed green zones and preserved corridors. Databases listed 0 residents. Risk assessments remained stable. Everything agreed with itself. Below, the land remembered differently. It remembered weight, the pressure of footsteps that once followed each other home, the vibration of engines slowing near houses, the pauses where people waited for help that did not come. Memory does not need witnesses. It needs time. Grass grew through asphalt slowly, deliberately, not erasing the road, but softening it, turning sharp edges into something passable, something forgettable. Animals crossed freely now, unaware they were walking over absence. Former residents stopped returning, not because they forgot, because there was nothing left to argue with. Places that deny your history eventually deny you too. Children who had grown up along the road became adults elsewhere. Their memories surfaced sometimes, triggered by the sound of tires on cracked pavement, by long stretches of quiet. but they learned to keep those memories private. Private pain does not disturb public narratives. Tourism declined eventually. Trends moved on. New empty places replaced old ones. The road lost its aesthetic value, then its economic value, and finally its relevance altogether. Silence returned, deeper than before. This time it did not feel temporary. From above, satellites still passed, confirming nothing had changed. From below, the ground held everything that never made it into records. Names not archived, deaths not investigated, lives simplified into absence. The road had not failed. It had performed exactly as designed. It had absorbed neglect, redirected responsibility, and disappeared without resistance. And when the last reference faded, when no one could say with certainty that people had ever lived there, the forgetting was complete. Not because the truth was lost, but because no one needed it anymore. The road remained. Not as a warning, not as a lesson, but as proof of how quietly things can vanish when silence is allowed to decide.